So no one would blame you if you said that all these three motorcycles basically look the same. So what's the difference between these? Why is this considered a pure street bike, but these two are considered adventure bikes? And why is the GS considered more off-road capable than this V-Strom here? So it's not any news that adventure riding has become a huge craze. It's probably one of the fastest growing, if not the most fastest growing segment in all of motorcycling right now. And because of that, there's a lot of debate and discussion out there about what is a true adventure bike, what is an off-road capable bike, and what isn't. In order to really talk about this, we're going to have to sort of loosely define what adventure riding is. So let's just say that it's a type of riding where you're riding a mix of street and dirt roads or off-road trails, and you're probably doing some touring or longer riding and possibly camping thrown into that mix. So I think in general, that's what adventure riding or adventure touring means. So when we use the term adventure in regards to motorcycling, we could just be talking about the style of a bike as opposed to an actual type of riding. So take something like this Kawasaki Versys 1000 LT. This is an incredible touring bike, a sport touring bike. It has no off-road pretenses and no off-road ability. Kawasaki might call it an all-roads bike, which means, okay, you can ride it through potholes, but it's not designed to be taken off-road. A lot of riders are moving from sport touring bikes or touring bikes to this kind of platform because they appreciate the wide handlebars, the extremely spacious and comfortable rider triangle, the ergonomics, and just the styling of the bike is something they like. A lot of people don't ride off-road, and that's perfectly fine, that's perfectly normal. I want you to see something on this V-Strom here. It says V-Strom, Sports Adventure Tourer. Well, what the heck is that? Now we have something called sport adventuring. What does that mean? So in my way of thinking, there's really four things that sort of set adventure bikes apart, or four requirements that an adventure bike must have. First is going to be the styling of the bike. How does it look? Now, we can kind of just actually say that one's nonsense anyway because styling doesn't matter, and you could have an adventure on a dirt bike or a street bike or whatever. But for the purposes of this, let's say the styling is something that matters. The second thing is going to be the ergonomics, sort of the riding position. So all three of these bikes so far meet criteria number one, which is styling, and also the riding position. They're all upright and spacious ergonomics, so they all meet that. The third requirement, I think, is the ability to travel long distances in relative comfort. All three of these bikes meet that criteria. However, here's the fourth thing, and this is where we start to get into a big debate: off-road ability. So what is it about some motorcycles that give them more off-road ability than others? That's what we need to figure out. All right, so I think off-road riding can really fit into three broad categories. The first is going to be just a simple graded flat dirt road. Cars travel on these roads all the time. You don't need special vehicles or special motorcycle to do it. You can go down a dirt road on a Goldwing or a cruiser, although I will admit that bikes like this make it a little bit easier, a bit more comfortable. The second type of off-roading is something like a two-track road, a fire road, a Jeep trail. These are going to have ruts, maybe some tree roots, some obstacles, rocks, embedded rocks, maybe some stream crossings, things, terrain that you have to deal with. You're going to need some suspension to deal with that. You're going to need some ground clearance to deal with that, and you're probably going to drop your bike. The third class of off-roading is the territory of dirt bikes. So I'm talking like technical single track terrain or extreme Jeep roads. So something where you're going to see people riding enduro bikes because you've got big ledges and you've got sharp switchbacks and you've got huge rocks you have to go over, and that's where adventure bikes really don't belong, but some people take them there anyway. So now it's time to delve into the various factors that make a bike more off-road capable than another bike. So let's jump in by starting to talk about wheel sizes. Wheel sizes are really a huge, overblown, over-exaggerated issue in my opinion. I was watching a review of the V-Strom 1050 by another channel, and they said, oh, the reason that the V-Strom can't go off-road is because it has a 19-inch front wheel. And I was sitting there thinking, no, that's completely wrong. That's not why a V-Strom sucks off-road. It's a variety of other reasons, which I'll cover in a later video, but that's not it. So why does wheel size matter? Well, the first thing is the choice of rubber. So because off-road tires really only come in 21-inch sizes and some 19-inch sizes, if you have a 17-inch wheel front like this Versys 1000 here, then you're very, very limited in terms of dual sport or off-road tires that you might be able to get. The second thing, and this is the most important thing, is how the bike handles off-road, how it's able to roll over obstacles in the trail. So obviously a larger diameter tire and wheel is going to go over bumps, rocks, roots, rock, all that kind of stuff better than a small wheel. So a smaller wheel will go to a bump and stop and get hung up, whereas a larger wheel will tend to roll over it. That being said, how much difference is there really between a 17, a 19, and a 21? Well, between a 17 and a 21, that's a pretty significant difference. Between a 19 and a 21, that difference is a lot smaller, and that's why I think when people say a 19-inch wheel is not off-road capable, I think that's a bunch of bull. But there is a difference. The second thing in talking about wheels, not just the sizes, is whether you have spokes or whether you have cast wheels. So like the cast wheels on this Versus, the problem with cast wheels for serious off-roading is that if you hit an obstacle hard enough, if you hit a rock or something, it could potentially bend the rim. And it could bend the rim enough where the tire won't hold air because it can't seal against the rim. The advantage of spoke wheels is that they're stronger against obstacles, but also they have some flex in them. They have some motion built into them so that when you're going over the terrain, it can absorb some of those impacts. So spoke wheels are something you're going to find on off-road oriented bikes and of course dirt bikes. Let's talk about ground clearance. You're going to need ground clearance to be able to clear obstacles and not get hung up and not damage things. So if you look at the GS here, this has quite a bit more ground clearance than something like the V-Strom. The other concern on the V-Strom is that your exhaust and oil filter and engine down here are very, very low and they have no protection. So the first time you hit a big off-road obstacle like a rock or a big rut or something, you're going to potentially damage your exhaust, tear your oil filter off, or put a hole in your engine. Now you can partially address this by having a good skid plate, but starting off with more ground clearance helps, and also starting off with a bike that has a design where it has a smooth underside and not exposed vulnerable components, that's also a big plus. So ground clearance is a key thing, and the more you have, the more off-road capability you have. Suspension travel, this is another big one. So the more suspension travel that you have, the more the motorcycle is able to absorb impacts from the terrain. So you're going to get a smoother and more controlled ride through rough terrain when you have more suspension travel. That's just the way it is. So if you look at this Versus here, it has extremely high quality electronic suspension, but it only has like 5-something inches of travel because that's how much travel you need on the street, and that's very closely engineered by people at these companies. That's how much travel you need to optimize performance. In the dirt, you need a lot more travel. Now the V-Strom back there only has around 6-something inches, which is really limiting for that bike. This GS has almost 9 inches because it's a GSA, and that means that when I take it off-road, it has a lot more ability to absorb the terrain and keep me in control of the ride. Now the downside to having long suspension travel is a couple things. One, when you're on the street, it's very difficult to control all that travel of the suspension, so it makes the bike wallowy and not handle as well. There's ways that can be dealt with through electronic suspension. Of course, BMW has their telelever design as well. The other downside of having long suspension travel is that that's going to push your seat height up higher. So the higher, everything gets, the higher you're going to be off the ground, the harder it is to reach the ground. That's also true for ground clearance, which I talked about a minute ago. So when you add ground clearance, you're typically, unless you can make like a totally small engine, which is impossible, you're going to push your seat height up. So that's something you got to keep in mind. We're not done talking about suspension. So suspension geometry, what do I mean? Well, the most important thing that I mean in a geometry is the rake angle of the front fork. So using the V-Strom as an example, when I ride the V-Strom off-road and I hit the slightest bit of soft soil, dirt, or sand, the front end becomes very unstable. It wants to knife into the sides and start to throw me off. There's ways you can ride around that, but in general, bikes need to be designed, if they're going to go off-road a lot, to have a little bit more stability and softer terrain, because sand, mud, things like that are inevitable if you ride off-road. So some bikes have more stability and others have less stability. There's a lot of factors that go into that, other designs of the frame, the suspension, how everything works together. But relatively speaking, bikes with a sharper rake angle, they do that to make it handle more nimble on the street, but off-road, it makes the bike more unstable and harder to control. When you ride off-road, you're going to fall down, you're going to crash. So we have to talk about crash worthiness. What do I mean? Well, for example, if I drop this Worthiness and crash this in the dirt, what's going to happen? Well, I'm potentially going to put a hole in this engine because it sticks out. I'm going to break all these plastic fairings. I'm going to break the turn signal off. This is plastic, so I may break my brake lever here. I'm going to impact all this stuff, and I'm going to have a really bad day. But on the GS over there, because it's got all the protection bars on it and is designed to go off-road, if I drop the bike over, nothing really happens. And trust me, I know from experience. So being able to take some spills without having a ride-ending damage is very, very important for any bike that's going to be taken off-road. Yes, the elephant in the room, literally the elephant when I'm sitting on this thing, weight. So here's what I will say about weight. The more experience you get as an off-road rider, the less weight is going to be a concern for you, because you're going to crash less, you're going to drop your bike less as you get more experienced, and it just doesn't worry you as much. Now, there's a lot of exceptions to that. If you get the bike stuck, if you crash it down like into a ravine or go into a gully and you need to pull it out, if you need to pick it up a lot, or if you get into really, really difficult off-road situations, then weight becomes a huge liability. And if you're not strong enough to deal with your motorcycle on your own, then you have a problem with weight. But it's going to be relative to how big you are, how tall you are, how experienced you are, how strong you are, and things like that. But in general, yes, a lighter weight bike has, by definition, more off-road capability than a heavyweight bike. That being said, for a lot of adventure touring on gravel roads, dirt roads, or even just moderate, fire roads, a bike like the GS is more than enough to get you through that kind of terrain. And the benefit is, on the highway and on the freeway, when you have a big heavy bike, it's incredibly stable. It doesn't get moved around by semi-trucks and traffic as much as a lighter weight bike does. So it kind of goes both ways. Yes, weight is a concern, but also the more experienced you are, the less of a problem that it is. So let's be honest with ourselves about something. For most of us, what's holding us back in our riding is not the brand or kind of motorcycle we ride, it's our own riding ability and our riding confidence. So we can talk all day about wheel sizes and ground clearance and tubeless tires versus spoked wheels and all this stuff. But what's more important is to get the experience, get the education and the training as a rider to understand how to handle motorcycles in general before getting too worried about all the specific stuff and all the specific gear and the fancy equipment. None of that really matters too much if you don't have the basic core competencies of handling a motorcycle in different terrain. So what I've been noticing about the adventure riding community, I said it's becoming very much like kind of more of a closed community, almost like the Harley-Davidson community is, where everyone's trying to buy the same bikes, everyone's buying the same kind of gear, the same kind of helmet, they're riding together, they're having their own separate rallies, their own separate clubs. And while there's really nothing wrong with that, it does seem a little bit to me like in our quest to be different and be rugged and be out there on the edge, we're actually all just copying each other, and it's kind of acting a little bit like sheep. So sorry if that hurts a little bit. I mean, I'm part of it, I get it, like I ride these adventure bikes, I have the fancy helmets and everything like that, but just something to think about, sometimes in our mission to be different, we end up being exactly the same as everyone else around us, so just something to keep in mind. But let me know what you all think. What makes up an adventure bike? Like, in your definition, what's an adventure bike and what isn't? And also, does that even matter? Or is this all just made up by marketing people to sell us gear and sell us more expensive motorcycles? Let me know what you think down below in the comments. I hope this video was informative and useful and all those kinds of things. Please hit subscribe and hit the bell. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. Please leave a comment, hit the thumbs up button. Until then, ride safe. We'll see you in the next video.
He did it.
But no, but that, where he is right there, you can't go down there, I don't think. You need to get in the rut. I think this is where we swap bikes. That's the big bikes.
Yeah, yeah.